Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about flexible nibs. You may have first seen a flexible nib on one of those oddly satisfying or ASMR videos on Instagram or Facebook where they're doing crazy calligraphy with a super flexible tip. While not all fountain pens are that flexible, there are some out there that are. And today I'm excited to show you some that can do crazy calligraphy, some that are more suited to daily use, and just generally some pretty cool pens. I'm going to be doing an introduction to what they are, how they work, their origins, and what they can be used for. I've got a pretty wide range of nibs in my collection, starting from some pretty stiff ones to some pretty crazy calligraphy ones, and I'm excited to show you the differences between all of them. First off, I'm going to introduce you to the origins of flexible nibs. Flexible nibs have existed since long before fountain pens became popular in the 1890s. At the time, dip pens were the main method of handwriting. They needed to be fine and very responsive to keep up with the type of handwriting. As such, fountain pens from this area are often very, very flexible. However, as inventions like the typewriter began to surface, handwriting shifted from elegantly shaded scripts to simpler, faster scripts, even shorthand ones such as the Gregg method. These favored stiff nibs, and flex nibs fell by the wayside. Before I show off some different flex nibs, I'm going to go over some terminology of nibs with you. So this is a nib and feed. Nibs can be made out of steel, palladium, titanium, or gold. At the point is what you call tipping material, a very hard piece of another metal welded onto the tip to ensure that the nib continues to write without wearing down. The tipping is attached to the tines, which are split by the slit. The slit is how the ink is carried to the tip via capillary action. It ends often in a breather hole, which distributes the material stress across a larger area and makes it more durable, especially for flexibility. The widest part of the nib are the shoulders, which taper into the body. The body is often where you'll find engravings with information about the pen. The feed on the left is what delivers the ink to the nib from the ink reservoir. The ink moves via capillary action through the feed channels. The depth, width, and number of these channels determine the ink flow of the pen. Around the sides and bottom of the feed, you'll find ridges or fins. These trap ink if too much is coming from the reservoir, which stops ink from dripping out. Now you may ask, why are some nibs flexible and some not? There are many characteristics that can indicate that a nib is flexible. First would be long tines. The longer the tines are, the more leverage you can get, and the easier it will be to bend. Thinner tines are also better for this as well. A very important factor is also the material of the nib. The best flex nibs are made out of 14 karat gold. Not all 14 karat gold nibs are flexible though. Many aren't, especially modern ones, and vintage flex nibs are made with a different 14 karat gold alloy than modern ones. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all type of rule. There are even steel and titanium flex nibs that are on the market today that are actually pretty nice. 14 karat gold nibs though are still the best. Alright, now to look at some pens. So this first one is actually not a flex nib. It is a modern gold nib pen. It's a Lamy Dialogue 3, and I'm kind of using this as my control. Modern gold nibs often have a little bit of give to them, but they should not be used as flex nibs. This one can only go from about a fine to a medium, and I would classify that as a soft nib, but definitely not flex. Next, we've got a much smaller pen. This is a Wall No. 0 ring top, dating from around 1920s era. It's called No. 0 because that's the size of the nib, and this one is actually very responsive. It kind of proves that good things can come in small packages. It is a semi-flex nib, going from an extra fine to about a broad. Next, we've got another old pen here. This is the Sheaffer Tuckaway. You may remember it from my earlier video. This one has an actually pretty unusual semi-flex nib. Normally these were made with very stiff nibs as they're somewhat later. This one also goes from about a fine to about a broad. Then we've got a Pelikan M400 in the white tortoise finish. This one is a modern ped with a vintage nib on it. So it is more flexible than a normal white tortoise Pelikan would be. This one is actually a little bit more flexible than the Schaefer Tuckaway, however it is still, I would consider a semi-flex. Then we've got our first full flex nib over here. This is a combination twin point Penno pencil, as you saw in my combination pen video. It has a more nib that is very nice amount of flex on there. It goes from about an extra fine to almost a double broad. Then we have an unusual flex nib. If you watched my San Francisco Pen Show recap video, you saw this pen. It is an Eversharp Skyline in the Silver Moire with a stub flex nib. So this one has line variation from just the shape of the tipping, but also the nib itself. This one is very, very flexible and definitely full flex for sure. This is the first pen to break away from the full flex area into the super flex area, which kind of denotes that it starts to become a little bit impractical for everyday use. This one is very soft, a little bit scratchy, and ridiculously flowy. It puts way too much ink down on the page. But it is a super flex and very, very fun to use. It goes from extra fine to over double broad. Then one that's a little bit more manageable but still super flex is this more safety pen from the early 1910s. It also has more nib. It is also very flexible but still pretty usable for daily use just because the nib itself is fairly stiff when unflexed. Though it does go from extra fine to double broad at least. And last but not least, the Schaefer Self Filler. This is the most flexible pen I have. It is a number 3 sized self-filling Schaefer nib, and what stands out about this pen is it has about the same line variation as the other two pens on this page, but it is very, very easy to flex, and some people would call this a wet noodle because how easy it is. And here are all the pens next to each other. All in all, as you just saw, there's a very, very wide range of flexibility when it comes to fountain pen nibs. However, more flexible doesn't necessarily mean better. I, for one, definitely don't want to be taking, pages and pages of lecture notes with a super flexible 1920s, 1930s flex nib. It's just not practical. So keep that in mind when you're looking for a flex nib of your own. You don't necessarily want the most flexible nib out there because then you just can't use it that often. I personally gravitate a lot to my Pelikan and my Schaefer pens just because they're stiff enough to be used in like a normal writing context, but if I want a little bit more personality out of my lines, I can press it a little bit. Obviously not as crazy expressive as my older Schaefer, but still good enough to get the job done. When it comes to drawing though, I do really like the flexibility of the older nibs. You can get super expressive lines, you can shade really well, while still retaining those very, very thin hairlines for like cross-hatching, as I showed in the drawing sample earlier. Vintage flex nibs can be kind of hard to find, especially in a way that's like reliable and you know you're gonna get it to work. So I definitely recommend buying them from a source that has like an established store and an established customer base. One that I really like is Peyton Street Pens. They have a pretty good selection of vintage flexible nibs if you're looking for something vintage. In terms of modern flex nibs, it gets kind of iffy. Some people would argue that no true flex nibs exist on the modern market. But there are some that I've tried that, you can get a solid semi-flex out of, which is often good enough, like I was saying. Ones that I personally have used and really liked in the past were the Pilot Falcon. I had one for a couple years, and that was like an everyday user for me. It comes in a pretty wide range of nib widths, which is also cool because in vintage pens it's hard to find stuff that's not just like a standard fine. You can get it in like a broad nib in the Pilot Falcon, which is pretty sweet. That one's still pretty expensive though. On the cheaper end, I do like the Fountain Pen Revolution flex nibs, and there'll be links to all these in the video description. I have experience with the Noodlers flex nibs, which are pretty popular these days. but I'm not a huge fan. Their pens just smell bad, which is usually something that you don't want, especially if you're taking it out into public. You don't want to be the guy with just like a gross pen. But you know, that might be worth it too if you're just not taking it out of the house, unless you want your writing space to smell bad. There's also a good amount of new aftermarket flex nibs on the market. They're pretty limited and kind of hard to find sometimes, but fpnibs.com in Spain does a really, really cool semi-flex gold nib. Those are pretty pricey, but they're awesome. They feel the closest I've felt to a vintage nib. Ralph Reyes of Regalia Writing Labs also does a steel flex nib that feels incredible. I tried one at the pen show recently, and they're super, super flexible even from just a steel nib. So I highly recommend checking those out. They always sell out pretty fast when he puts up a new batch, but they are excellent. I highly recommend trying them out. Overall, I hope this video was informative to you wondering about flex nibs, or those who already knew about them and were looking just for some fun writing samples with them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.